Have you ever felt that forbidden spark, that undeniable pull towards someone you shouldn't? Imagine that person is your boss. Working late nights can lead to unexpected moments, especially when your boss is involved. But what happens when those late nights turn into something more? Prepare for a story of office secrets, hidden feelings, and a connection that goes beyond professional boundaries. You're about to hear a true gay story that will leave you breathless. The quiet evening in the office was supposed to be just another night, but when he walked closer, everything I thought I knew about my life changed in a heartbeat. If you'd asked me 6 months ago where I saw my career going, I'd have given you a simple, predictable answer. A steady job, slow but steady promotions, and maybe, just maybe, a window office one day. But then I met Mr. Anderson, my boss, and the idea of a safe, planned future disappeared in an instant. With him, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. It was one of those cold mornings when the coffee isn't quite strong enough, and the routine of the office feels like it could lull you to sleep. I pushed through the revolving doors, bundled up in a thick coat, barely looking up as I made my way toward the elevator. But the second I glanced across the lobby, I saw him, Mr. Anderson, leaning against the marble reception counter, looking anything but ordinary. In a month since I joined the firm, I'd learned quickly that Mr. Anderson was a man who didn't quite fit the traditional mold of a corporate leader. Everyone knew him as a force of nature, someone who could be both charming and intimidating with the same smile. He had this ability to make you feel like you were the only person in the room when he spoke to you, like he'd zoomed in on something essential. And when his eyes landed on me that morning, I felt a jolt run through me, sharper than the cold outside. "Good morning," he said, his tone smooth yet somehow serious. I managed a polite nod, my usual response, and turned to press the elevator button, but his voice cut through the air again, stopping me. "Got a minute? There's something I'd like to discuss with you." There was a faint smile on his lips, but his eyes held that intense gaze he always wore, a look that said he had a purpose in mind, a reason for everything. I followed him to a corner of the lobby where the morning light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows. I felt an odd sense of anticipation, but I told myself it was just another task, just another project he wanted me to handle. "I need someone who can keep a secret," he began, his voice low and steady. "Someone I can trust beyond the usual office politics." I blinked, trying to process his words. This wasn't the start of a project briefing or a strategy meeting. There was something almost personal in the way he spoke, and it caught me off guard. His eyes locked onto mine, waiting for an answer. "Of course," I said, a little too quickly, feeling a strange blend of curiosity and uncertainty. "You can trust me." He smiled, but there was something almost unreadable in it, something that made me feel like he was testing me, as though he was seeing if I'd break under the weight of his gaze. "Good. I had a feeling about you." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the lobby, my mind whirling with questions. It was an unusual start to the day, and for the rest of the morning, his words lingered in the back of my mind. I tried to shake them off, throwing myself into work, but the feeling wouldn't go away. By lunchtime, I'd almost convinced myself that I'd misread the whole thing, that maybe he just meant I'd be on a sensitive project. But when I returned to my desk, there was a new email from him waiting in my inbox. No subject line, just a single sentence that made my pulse quicken. "Meet me in the cafe across the street after work." I stared at the message, feeling a strange blend of nerves and curiosity. Meeting him outside of work hours was unusual to say the least, but I knew I couldn't refuse. I closed the email, trying not to read too much into it. But as the clock ticked down to the end of the day, I felt the anticipation build. Finally, at 5 sharp, I grabbed my coat and made my way to the cafe. It was one of those old-fashioned places with dim lighting and warm wooden interiors, a cozy spot that didn't quite match the modern, high-tech office environment we worked in. I spotted him immediately, seated at a small table in the corner, a coffee in hand, his gaze fixed on the street outside. As I approached, he looked up, his eyes softening just slightly. He gestured to the seat across from him, and I slid into it, feeling a bit out of place, almost like I was intruding on a private moment. He took a sip of his coffee, not saying anything at first, just studying me with that unreadable expression. "I want to talk to you outside the office," he said, finally breaking the silence. "Sometimes things are better left separate." I nodded, unsure of what to say. His words held an underlying weight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than just work. But before I could ask, he leaned forward, his gaze intense, almost piercing. "There's something I'm working on," he began, his voice low. "It's unconventional, but I need someone I can trust with it." He didn't elaborate, didn't give any details, but his eyes held mine, as if he were waiting for me to agree before he revealed more. I felt a strange thrill, a mix of curiosity and excitement. I nodded, not quite trusting my voice to respond. For a brief moment, he smiled, and it was the kind of smile that felt like a reward, like he just decided to let me in on something important. "Good," he said softly, leaning back in his chair. "I had a feeling you'd understand." He picked up his coffee again, taking a slow sip, his gaze still fixed on me. "Tell me," he said, his tone casual but his eyes intense. "What brought you here? Why this job?" I blinked, caught off guard by the question. It was such a personal thing to ask, and it felt strange coming from him, a man who usually kept his own life locked away behind a wall of professionalism. But something about the way he looked at me, the quiet intensity in his eyes, made me want to answer honestly. "I guess I wanted something challenging," I said slowly, choosing my words carefully, something that would push me, something that would make me better. He nodded as if he understood exactly what I meant. For a few minutes, we just sat there, the silence between us comfortable yet charged. I felt like I was on the edge of something, like this conversation was leading somewhere unexpected, somewhere I hadn't anticipated. When he finally broke the silence, his voice was softer, almost hesitant. "Sometimes we have to take risks to get what we want," he said, his gaze locked onto mine, "to push ourselves beyond what we think we're capable of." I wasn't sure what he meant, but his words resonated with me, lingering in the air between us. There was something about the way he spoke, a kind of vulnerability that I'd never seen in him before. And as we sat there, our eyes meeting across the small table, I felt a strange sense of connection, as if we were both on the same path, both searching for something beyond the ordinary. Eventually, he glanced at his watch, a small frown crossing his face. "I have to get going," he said, his tone regretful. "But I want you to think about what we discussed about trust." He stood up, leaving a few bills on the table, and looked at me one last time. "See you tomorrow," he said softly, his eyes lingering on me for a moment before he turned and walked out, disappearing into the evening crowd. I sat there for a long time, my mind racing with everything he'd said. It felt like I was on the edge of something significant, something I couldn't quite define yet. And as I walked home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something that would change everything. The next morning, I could barely concentrate. Mr. Anderson's words from last night looped in my mind. Sometimes we have to take risks to get what we want. There was something unspoken behind those words, like a line I was being invited to cross, but not told outright. I arrived at the office feeling a strange mix of nerves and anticipation, wondering if he'd even acknowledge the conversation from cafe. The hours trickled by with no word from him. It was as if nothing had changed. Mr. Anderson was in and out of meetings, barely glancing my way as he strode through the office with that air of focus he always wore. Part of me felt relieved that he hadn't singled me out, but another part couldn't ignore the sinking disappointment that maybe whatever had sparked between us was just my imagination. At lunch, I decided to clear my mind with a walk around the block. Just as I was about to head back inside, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Mr. Anderson. "Conference room now." My heart pounded as I hurried inside, weaving my way through the rows of desks and hallways to the conference room. When I entered, I was surprised to see only him. He stood by the large window, his hands in his pockets, looking out over the city skyline. He didn't turn when I walked in, and the silence stretched thin between us. "Close the door," he said finally, his voice low, carrying a weight that made my pulse quicken. I did as he asked, and the soft click of the door seemed to hang in the air for a moment. He stayed quiet, then turned to face me, his eyes unreadable. "You're probably wondering why I asked you here," he began, his gaze intense. "It's not easy for me to trust people, especially in this industry, but I've been watching you since you joined, and there's something about you, something that makes me believe you can handle what I'm about to ask." He took a step closer, and I felt the space between us shrink, the air thickening with tension. "I have a project," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "that requires someone discreet, someone willing to take on risks that aren't exactly part of the usual job description." My throat went dry, but I managed a nod. "I can handle it, whatever it is." He studied me, his gaze piercing. "Are you sure? Once you agree, there's no going back. This isn't. It's not standard office work, it's personal." His words hung in the air, heavy and charged. I could feel my pulse racing, but I nodded, holding his gaze. "I'm sure." For a moment, he just looked at me, as if weighing my answer, assessing whether I truly understood what I was getting into. Then he stepped back, a faint, almost reluctant smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Good," he said softly, his eyes lingering on mine. "Meet me tonight, after hours." I didn't ask any questions, didn't press him for details. All I could feel was the rising tension, the unspoken promise in his words. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, going through the motions of work, but unable to focus on anything. The minutes seemed to crawl by, each one bringing me closer to whatever awaited that evening. When the office finally emptied out, I made my way to his office, the silence around me amplifying the anticipation building in my chest. Mr. Anderson was waiting, his expression unreadable as he motioned for me to close the door behind me. The dim light cast shadows across his face, highlighting the intensity in his gaze. "Let's go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He led me down the corridor and out of the building to a sleek black car waiting at the curb. We drove in silence, the city lights flashing by as we wound our way through unfamiliar streets. Finally, he pulled up in front of a quiet, secluded restaurant I'd never seen before. He parked, glanced at me, and without a word, stepped out of the car. Inside, the restaurant was dimly lit and nearly empty, the soft hum of jazz music filling the air. Mr. Anderson led me to a private booth at the back, far from the few other patrons scattered throughout the space. He ordered us drinks, and for a while, we sat in silence, the tension between us palpable, like a current crackling just beneath the surface. Finally, he leaned forward, his gaze intense. "I need someone I can trust with this project, but it goes beyond trust. I need someone committed, someone who can keep this separate from everything else, from work, from other distractions." I swallowed, feeling the weight of his words. There was a hesitation in his eyes, a flicker of something unguarded that I hadn't seen before. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, the silence between us stretching, charged with an intensity that neither of us seemed willing to break. "Understand," I said quietly, holding his gaze. "I can do that." His eyes softened just for a moment, and he nodded. "Good. Then let's drink to it," he said, raising his glass. We clinked glasses, and as we drank, the atmosphere shifted, growing warmer, more intimate. The tension that had been simmering all day seemed to settle into something deeper, something neither of us could ignore. I could feel his gaze on me, lingering, searching, as if he were waiting for me to make the first move. After the drinks, he walked me out, the cool night air a sharp contrast to the warmth inside. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the city lights casting shadows around us. Then, without warning, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and I felt a spark, a jolt of electricity that made my breath catch. He didn't say anything, didn't move any closer, just looked at me with that intense gaze that seemed to strip away every layer, leaving me feeling raw, exposed. And in that moment, I realized there was no going back. We'd crossed an invisible line, and nothing would ever be the same. We stood there for a long moment, caught in that charged silence. Then he turned, glancing over his shoulder. "Come with me." I followed him, my heart pounding as we walked in silence, our footsteps echoing down the empty street. We ended up at a small, quiet bar tucked away in a side alley. The place was empty except for the bartender, who gave Mr. Anderson a nod as we entered. We settled into a corner booth, the dim light casting shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp angles and the intensity in his eyes. For the next hour, we talked about everything and nothing, work, life, the choices that had led us here. But beneath the words, there was a tension that neither of us could ignore, a magnetic pull that seemed to draw us closer with every passing minute. At some point, he reached across the table, his hand brushing against mine. It was a subtle gesture, but it sent a shiver through me, a jolt that made my heart skip a beat. I looked up, meeting his gaze, and in that moment, I saw something unguarded in his eyes, a vulnerability that took me by surprise. He didn't pull away, didn't break the contact, just held my gaze, his fingers lingering against mine. And in that quiet, intimate moment, I felt something shift, something that had been building between us, finally breaking free. Eventually, he let his hand slip away, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "We should get back," he murmured, his voice soft, almost reluctant. We walked back in silence, the city lights casting long shadows around us. When we reached my apartment building, he paused, looking at me with that same intense gaze that had haunted me all day. "Think about what we discussed," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "And let me know if you're ready to take this on. All of it." I nodded, my heart pounding as I watched him turn and walk away, his figure disappearing into the shadows. I stood there for a long time, my mind racing with everything that happened, the unspoken promise hanging heavy in the air. That night, I lay awake, replaying every moment, every look, every touch, feeling the weight of it settle over me like a shroud. I knew that I'd crossed a line, that whatever came next would change everything. But despite the risks, the uncertainty, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was ready to take on whatever this was, whatever lay beyond that unspoken line we'd crossed. And as the first light of dawn crept through my window, I made my decision. The days following that night were filled with an unspoken tension. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening between Mr. Anderson and me, something that went beyond the usual professional boundaries. Every glance, every word seemed to carry an underlying meaning that neither of us was willing to fully acknowledge, but I knew it was building. And sooner or later, it would spill over into something we couldn't ignore. I hadn't responded to his request. Part of me wanted to jump into whatever he had planned, but another part hesitated. It wasn't just the professional risks at stake, it was everything else. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the quiet power he held over me, and it was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. But despite my hesitation, I couldn't stop thinking about him. He consumed my thoughts. Each encounter with him leaving me more tangled in the web he seemed to be weaving around me. The nights were the hardest, when the silence would settle in and all I could do was replay the way his hand had brushed against mine, the way his voice had dropped to that low, intimate tone when he told me about the project. It was a week later when he called me into his office again, his usual calm demeanor hiding the tension that had started to creep into the way he interacted with me. He barely looked up when I walked in, but there was something in his eyes, something deep and unreadable that made my heart race. "Close the door," he said, not bothering to look up from his desk. I did as instructed, feeling the door click shut behind me, sealing us in this small, confined space. He finally looked up, his gaze locking onto mine. It was like a spark had been lit, and I couldn't tear my eyes away. He leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming lightly on the desk, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I think it's time we take this a little further." The words hung in the air, thick with implication. My throat tightened, and I couldn't find my voice at first, but he didn't seem to need me to respond immediately. He stood up, his movement deliberate, and walked around the desk, stopping just a few inches away from me. The space between us seemed to shrink with every step he took, and my body tensed instinctively. Wanted to pull away, but I couldn't. I was drawn to him. "Do you trust me?" he asked, his voice low and surprisingly soft, almost as if he were testing the waters. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. "Yes, I trust you." He nodded slowly, as if satisfied with my answer. There was a long pause where the world outside seemed to fade away. The only thing that mattered was the heavy silence in the room, the electric pull that seemed to hang between us, making it impossible to ignore. Without another word, his hand reached out, brushing a strand of hair away from my face. The touch was light, almost tender, but it sent a shock wave of heat through my body. He lingered there for a moment, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw, sending a rush of warmth to my skin. "You know," he murmured, his voice barely audible, "I've never been good at holding back." His eyes flickered down to my lips before locking onto my gaze again, as if he were waiting for me to make the next move. It was as if time itself had stopped. I could feel my breath quicken, the air between us thickening. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could almost hear it, a frantic rhythm that drowned out everything else. And in that moment, I couldn't deny it anymore. I wanted him. Before I could think about it, I closed the distance between us, my lips meeting as in a kiss that was both tentative and urgent. It wasn't forceful, but it was full of an unspoken longing that neither of us had been able to ignore. He responded almost immediately, his hand sliding to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, deepening the kiss. There was no going back now. The kiss was slow at first, as if we were both testing the waters, gauging each other's reactions. But as our bodies pressed closer, the heat between us grew more intense. His fingers threaded into my hair, tugging me closer, and I felt his breath quicken against my skin. I had never felt so alive, so exposed, yet so completely connected to someone at the same time. I broke the kiss for a moment, my forehead resting against his. "Are you sure about this?" I whispered, my voice shaky. He didn't answer at first, just looked at me with that steady gaze, as if he were searching for something deep within my soul. Then, without a word, he kissed me again, this time with more urgency, as if he couldn't resist the gravitational pull between us. His lips were insistent, his hands roaming to my waist, pulling me even closer until our bodies were entwined, our hearts beating in perfect sync. We can't control the force between us, I thought, as our bodies met, wrapping each other in a warm embrace. His hands cradled my face, and I felt the heat of his touch radiate through every cell. My hands found their way to his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath the fabric of his shirt, echoing the rhythm of mine. The world outside the office melted away, leaving only the two of us, lost in the intensity of the moment. Time stood still as our bodies swayed together, our breath mingling in a sensual dance. I couldn't think. I didn't want to think. All I wanted was to surrender to the sensation of his body pressed against mine, to let go of everything else and just be in this moment. But then, just as quickly as it had started, he pulled away, his breath coming in short gasps. I looked up at him, confused, wanting more, but not sure how to ask. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of satisfaction and something else. Something I couldn't quite place, a glimmer of vulnerability perhaps, or a hint of longing. "Do you regret it?" I asked softly, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes dark and intense. Then he shook his head. "No," he said, his voice low but steady. "But we need to be careful. This changes everything." I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. It was true, this wasn't just some passing moment. It was a turning point. We couldn't go back to how things were before. Not after what had just happened. But there was more. Something in the way he looked at me. Something in his touch told me that this wasn't over. It was only the beginning of whatever this was between us. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said quietly, his voice softer than before. And with that, he stepped back, leaving me standing there in the office, breathless, unsure of what the next step would be, but knowing deep down that I couldn't walk away from this. As I made my way back to my desk, I tried to compose myself, my heart still pounding in my chest. What had just happened? What had we started? I didn't know, but I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him, the magnetic connection that seemed to have been building since the first moment we met. And as I sat down, trying to focus on the work in front of me, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The lines between professional and personal had blurred beyond recognition, and I wasn't sure where this would lead. But I knew one thing for certain. I was in too deep to turn back now. The days that followed were a whirlwind, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was on the edge of something I couldn't control. It wasn't just about the project anymore. It wasn't just about work. There was something deeper between Mr. Anderson and me now. Something raw and unspoken that neither of us was willing to address head-on. We had crossed a line, but neither of us had any clear idea of where we were headed. Each day felt like a balance between professionalism and the undeniable tension simmering just beneath the surface. At work, nothing had changed outwardly. We both kept up the facade of business as usual, yet every word, every glance between us seemed to carry an unspoken weight. It was like we were both walking on a tightrope, afraid of what would happen if either of us lost our footing. But then there were moments when our eyes would meet across the room, and it felt like everything else disappeared. There was this unspoken understanding, a silent acknowledgement of what had happened between us and what it meant. It wasn't something either of us could say out loud. Not yet, but it was there, lurking in the quiet spaces between us. The week following that night felt like a test. Mr. Anderson began pulling me into more meetings, giving me more responsibility. He wasn't exactly subtle about his intentions, but he never crossed a line in public. There were moments when his gaze would linger a little too long, when his touch would seem just a little too intentional, and every time I found myself drawn to him, unable to resist. But there were also moments when things felt distant. He would retreat back into his professional mask, keeping a careful distance, as if reminding both of us that we couldn't let this affect our work. It left me questioning everything. One night, nearly 2 weeks after our first kiss, Mr. Anderson called me into his office once again. I was ready for another late-night discussion about the project, or so I thought. But when I walked in, the usual professional energy between us was gone. He was sitting at his desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and his face was more serious than I'd ever seen it. "I need you to understand something," he said, his voice steady. But there was an underlying tension there. "This isn't just about the project anymore." My heart skipped a beat, and I stepped forward, trying to keep my expression neutral. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He set the glass down, his fingers lingering on the rim for a moment before he looked up at me, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that felt like a physical force. "I mean this, what's happening between us can't be ignored, but it also can't be rushed. I don't want you to think this is something you'll regret." I swallowed, trying to make sense of his words. There was something in his gaze, something that was both reassuring and terrifying at the same time. He was giving me an out, but he was also pulling me deeper into whatever this was. And in that moment, I realized I didn't want to pull away. "I don't regret it," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "I don't want to stop." For a long moment, he didn't speak. His gaze softened, and he stood up, walking slowly toward me. He was so close now that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, the closeness palpable, the air between us crackled with energy, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. He didn't say anything. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing the side of my face. His touch was gentle, almost reverent, as if he were afraid of breaking something fragile between us. I closed my eyes for a moment, savoring the warmth of his touch before I felt his lips, soft and warm, press against my forehead. When he pulled away, he didn't speak immediately. Instead, he just stood there, studying me, as if trying to read something I wasn't saying. Then his hand slid into mine, and he led me to the door. "Come with me," he murmured, his voice soft yet commanding. There was no question in his tone, no hesitation. We walked out of the office, past the empty cubicles, and out into the night. The city seemed different in the quiet hours after work, the streets bathed in the soft glow of street lights. We didn't speak, just walked side by side, our hands still connected, the space between us almost unbearable. When we reached his apartment building, he led me inside, and we took the elevator up in silence. The moment the door opened, I felt a shift, something unmistakable in the air. This was no longer about work, no longer about the project or the responsibility that came with it. This was something else, something personal. His apartment was sleek and minimalistic, everything in its place, yet there was a warmth to it that I hadn't expected. He led me to the living room, where the lights were dim, the only illumination coming from a few candles flickering on the table. "Stay," he said, his voice low. It wasn't a question, it was an invitation, one I couldn't resist. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing. I could feel the tension in the room, in the air, in the space between us. It was impossible to ignore the way my body reacted to his presence, the way I could feel the pull between us drawing me closer. And then, without a word, he stepped forward, closing the distance between us in a single movement. His hands cupped my face, and this time there was no hesitation, no distance. His lips met mine with a kiss that was slow, deliberate, and deep. It wasn't the frantic, desperate kiss from the office. This was different. It was softer, more intimate, as though we were both giving in to something that had been building for far too long. I melted into the kiss, my hands sliding up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my fingers. I felt him pull me closer, his body pressing against mine, and I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. All that mattered was the feel of him, the connection between us that seemed to deepen with every second. When we broke apart, we didn't say anything, we didn't need to. The silence was enough. We knew where this was heading, and neither of us was willing to stop it. He led me to his bedroom, where the world outside ceased to exist. There were no more walls between us, no more boundaries. Just the undeniable connection we shared. The night unfolded in a blur of heated touches and soft whispers, each moment building upon the last until we were both lost in the space between us. As the night wore on and we finally lay there together, the weight of everything settled in. What had started as a simple professional relationship had grown into something much more complex. There were no clear answers, no easy resolutions, but there was something undeniable between us, a connection that neither of us could deny, no matter how much we tried to fight it. When the first light of dawn crept through the blinds, I found myself thinking about what had happened, about what we had just shared. I didn't know what the future held or where this would lead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. I didn't need answers right now. All I needed was this moment and the promise of what might come next. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Wow, what a powerful story of unexpected connection. If you're moved by this true gay story, please give this video a like. For more emotional, romantic, and heart-wrenching LGBT stories, subscribe to LGBT Stories channel and comment below what you thought of this story. What would you have done in this situation? Let's discuss in the comments. Thanks for watching.